it was the way, the only way to a new beginning. And so at 10:26 a.m. on Friday, 27th August 2010, with a single stroke of his pen, President Mwai Kibaki endorsed the draft constitution, and there was a dawn of a new era. Before an ecstatic Kenyan people, and as cannons broke into a 21-gun salute, the president released 2 white doves as a sign of peace, love, hope, marking the birth of the Second Republic. Having emerged from this phase, Kenya of the Constitution called the Basic Structure. Under Article 368 of the Constitution of India, it is Parliament and Parliament alone that is reposed of the power to amend the Constitution. And indeed, clauses 4 and 5 even explicitly limits the power of the courts to review any act of Parliament to amend the Constitution. No amendment of the Constitution made by Parliament pursuant to the provisions of the Constitution can be called in question in any court in India on any ground. However, in construing Article 368 and the limitations on the powers of the court to question the power of Parliament, notwithstanding, the Supreme Court in Casavenanda held that although the article donates exclusive power to Parliament to amend any provision of the Constitution in accordance with the procedure in that article, the powers could not be used to damage, emasculate, destroy, abrogate, change, or alter the basic structure or the framework of the Constitution. The theory was itself influenced by the Germans' political and constitutional history. Under Article 76 of the Germans' original constitution, called the Weimar Constitution, Parliament had the power to amend the Constitution with the procedural restraints that required 2/3 votes of the members of its parliament to pass an amendment. Adolf Hitler, that well-known but reviled figure in history, used this same procedure, a procedure which is anchored in the Constitution, effortlessly to overhaul the entire Weimar Constitution, and arbitrarily took away rights to freedoms of speech, expression, association, and habeas corpus. He then declared the state of emergency. This experience was to inform Germans' constitutional reforms. In their new constitution, the Grand Gazette, the Basic Law, substantive limits have been introduced to the amending power of Parliament. Article 79 of the Basic Law explicitly bars any amendment to the provisions concerning the basic principles like federalism, democracy, rule of law, separation of powers. Our own history is equally replete with the examples and instances that led to agitation for constitutional reforms, as the former constitution was in no better ranking than the Indian or the Weimar constitutions. The former constitution provided for its alteration as opposed to amendment under Section 47 and vested wholly the power to amend it in Parliament, a common denominator with the Indian and the Weimar constitutions. Our Parliament under Section 47, like parliaments of the two nations, could indiscriminately change, and did in fact change, the Constitution at will in any manner whatsoever without reference to the people. The history of agitation to reverse the trend and save the Constitution leading to the promulgation of the 2010 Constitution is well known and are chronicled in detail in my main judgment. But why is this history important? Just like India and Germany, where the seed of basic structure doctrine was planted, it is their unique history that influenced the path of constitutional reforms and the decision of the courts in those jurisdictions in applying the doctrine. Constitutions the world over reflect the uniqueness and specificity of each society, even if lessons or experiences can be drawn from those places. In the Kenyan situation, drawing from the past, informed by the present, and focusing on the future, the 2010 Constitution has set up a framework which returns Kenya to the path of democratization. Parliament cannot be used to pass amendments to the Constitution in the manner it did before 2010 because of the current inbuilt mechanisms and safeguards, as well as the complex and elaborate procedures in the Constitution itself. The situation the Supreme Court of India was addressing in Kesavananda is unique to India based on the specific provisions of the Indian Constitution, Article 368 to be exact, their experience and also based on their history generally. Therefore, in relying on Kesavananda, hook, line, and sinker to address the peculiar circumstances of Kenya, the superior courts below ought to have exercised caution and followed the guidelines repeatedly emphasized by this court in various cases, Judges and Magistrates Vetting Board and the Rai case. Courts ought to avoid mechanistic approaches to president because it is inappropriate to pick a president all over the world simply because they appear to provide an answer to a matter at hand. Each of those presidents has its place in the jurisprudence of its own country of origin. There was justification to rely on Kesavananda in interpreting Section 47 of the former Constitution in the Njoya case, because at the time our constitutional framework was more or less similar to Article 368 of the Indian Constitution, in the sense that the power to amend the Constitution reposed in Parliament and Parliament alone. But this is no longer the case in Kenya. Throughout the constitutional making process, from the Bomas draft, the Wako draft, the revised harmonized draft, and the proposed draft constitution, it has been made abundantly clear that since the Constitution embodies the will and aspirations of the people, they must be central to its amendment, and that there ought to be a balance to have a Constitution that is flexible enough for posterity and unforeseen needs, but rigid enough to prevent the abusive hyper-amendments of yesteryears. This balance was achieved by clear, unambiguous, and distinct tiered or multi-stage design model, codified in Chapter 16, applying different procedures of amendment for different provisions of the Constitution. Specifically, amendment process of any matters in Article 255(1) is complex and onerous. It requires support of 1 million voters, requires the promoters to draft a bill, which then must be verified by the IEBC, and finally, and approval by the county assemblies and parliament, meeting a certain threshold, and finally ratified in a referendum. Attempts to utilize both parliamentary and popular initiatives have failed, essentially because of the tiered or multi-stage design of Chapter 16. You remember the Okoa Kenya Bill of 2016, Punguza Mizigo Bill of 2019. To this extent, even the two courts below agree that Article 255(1) embodies the basic structure of the Constitution of Kenya. For me, the most difficult part of the two judgments of the two courts below, and the dilemma flowing from them, is the imprecise scope and extent of basic structure doctrine. Which provision in the Constitution of Kenya, for instance, are not amendable through the procedure in Chapter 16? What does it mean, for instance, when the High Court and the Court of Appeal accept, on the one hand, that all articles in the Constitution are amendable in accordance with the constitutional procedures provided, but on the other, qualifies the statement by declaring that basic structure of that very Constitution cannot be altered using the amendment power in the Constitution? What does it mean when they declare that the basic structure consists of the preamble, the 18 chapters, the 16 schedules? Is it the Constitution is in entirety as a basic structure? Where do Kenyans who wish to propose amendments to the Constitution go to be shown which provisions cannot be amended using Chapter 16 procedure? Do they go to some deity, some oracle of Delphi, for instance? In interpreting the Constitution, courts must provide pragmatic solutions without adding confusion to the controversy that the parties have brought to them for resolution in the first place. Amending the Constitution is not a light matter, therefore, limitations to its amendment must sufficiently be specific and unambiguous. In India today, because of the nebulous nature of implied limitations to constitutional amendment since Kesavananda case, every court has attempted to identify by listing some of the essential structural elements of the Constitution that in their individual perceptions constitute the basic structure of the Indian Constitution on a case-to-case basis. Chapter 16 exhaustively sets out the process of initiating an amendment to the protected provisions. Of course, That process includes public participation and a referendum. That is in answer to the question of where is the juridical basis in the Kenyan context for the proposition by the two courts that the basic structure of the Constitution can only be amended through primary constituent power, which must include four sequential processes, namely civic education, public participation, and coalition of views, constituent assembly, debate, and ultimately a referendum. The last matter under this ground is to consider the unanimous conclusion by both superior courts below that the proposed amendments in the draft bill amounted to dismemberment of the Constitution. Besides the number of articles sought to be amended, the courts were concerned about the overall effect, that they were so far-reaching in character, scope, and content as to, and I quote, shake the foundation and alter the identity and character of the Constitution as to effectively dismember it. The learned judges variously defined the word dismemberment to mean doing any of the following in the Constitution: unmaking, replacing, disassemble, completely change identity, abolish, tear apart, amputate, and rough mutilation. Do the proposals in the amendment draft bill create a new constitution? Do the verbs unmake, replace, disassemble, completely change identity, abolish, tear apart, amputate, employed by the learned judges to describe the proposals in the bill and to suggest that the proposals were a dismemberment of the Constitution, are they so? In my most respectful view, these words were an overkill, and the sledgehammer employed to deal with them was in itself disproportionate. I end this ground where I started. However great, however progressive a written constitution may be, history, experiences, and changes in society would necessitate corresponding changes to the written text of the Constitution, with each generation having the right and freedom to determine the law under which they wish to live. And no generation should bind the course, aspirations, constitutional expectations, values, principles, and objects of generations to come. The language of Chapter 16 is clear and plain, leaving no room for conjecture, inference, or implication. Neither the explicit nor the implicit language of the Constitution, the history of constitutional making, or any principle of constitutional interpretation in this country permits the courts to do what the courts have accused previous parliaments of perpetuating, that is, to undertake indiscriminate and radical amendments to the Constitution by imposing an alien method of amending it. In the result, I would set aside the judgment of the Court of Appeal and hold that to the extent that the basic structure doctrine limits the amendment power contrary to the express terms of Chapter 16 of the Constitution, it does not apply to the Constitution of Kenya, and that there are no four sequential steps for the amendment of the Constitution other than the steps outlined in Chapter 16. The second issue is on the role of the President in the process. This question to me, and of course the question of basic structure doctrine, are the real nerves of this dispute. This particular question seeks to answer the issue of legality, legitimacy, and constitutionality of the process leading to the formulation of the draft bill based on the true construction of Article 257. The High Court was persuaded and declared that the President does not have authority under the Constitution to initiate changes by way of amendment. That a constitutional amendment can only be initiated either by Parliament through parliamentary initiative under Article 256 or by a popular initiative under 257. The Court of Appeal, in a unanimous decision, agreed and affirmed that conclusion. Friday afternoon, March 9th, 2018, which was the same day the justices of the Court of Appeal elected me as their president at Safari Park Hotel, will be remembered as one of the many defining moments in the history of Kenya. It was on that day that, in a move that took many by surprise, the president and his political opponent, Honorable Odinga, with whom he had recently engaged in fiercest and bare-knuckle political contest, met and agreed in what has come to be known as the handshake.
That is Justice William Ouko, live from the Supreme Court there, giving his verdict after CJ Martha Koome did give her verdict on the BBI. And we interrupt that ruling to take you to Nakuru, where the Kenya Military Academy is situated, and the head of state, President Uhuru Kenyatta, is commissioning a parade for graduate general service officer cadets. We'll be back a little bit later.